Sometimes, a single act of kindness doesn't just change a moment, it rewrites a destiny. The fireworks hadn't started yet, but the city already felt louder than usual, like everyone was rushing towards something brighter, something better, while Emily Parker stood frozen under the harsh fluorescent lights of a late-night grocery store, clutching a can of baby formula like it was the last fragile piece of hope she had left. Her fingers trembled as she emptied her purse onto the counter, coins spilling out in uneven clinks that sounded far too loud in the quiet tension around her, pennies, nickels, a few worn quarters, each one counted twice as if they might somehow multiply under pressure, but they didn't, they never did. Behind her, a man sighed impatiently, the sound sharp enough to cut through her already fraying nerves, and somewhere to her left, a child laughed, a reminder of a world that felt distant from her own. "Ma'am, you're short $3.50, the cashier said flatly, not unkind, but not soft either, just tired, like she had seen this scene too many times before to feel anything at all. Emily swallowed hard, her throat dry, her eyes flickering toward the small bundle in her arms where baby Noah stirred, his tiny face scrunched in restless discomfort, unaware of numbers, of shortages, of how close they were to going home empty-handed. I can take something off, she whispered, though there was nothing else in her basket, nothing left to give up, nothing left to negotiate. The silence that followed wasn't empty, it was heavy, filled with judgment that no one spoke aloud but everyone seemed to feel. Then, a movement behind her. A hand reached forward, calm, steady, placing a crisp bill on the counter as if it weighed nothing at all. "That covers it," a low voice said, smooth and unhurried, like time moved differently around him. Emily turned, startled, her breath catching as she met the eyes of a man who didn't look away, didn't rush, didn't carry the irritation she had grown used to seeing in strangers. Daniel Carter didn't smile, but there was something in his expression that felt warmer than any polite gesture, something grounded, deliberate. "You don't have to," she began, instinctively pulling back, pride flickering even in exhaustion, but he gently shook his head. "Every baby deserves to be fed," he said simply, as if it wasn't generosity, as if it was just the way things should be. No lecture, no expectation, no pause waiting for gratitude. Just a quiet truth that settled somewhere deep inside her chest. The cashier finished the transaction without comment, sliding the formula into a thin plastic bag that crinkled softly as Emily took it, her fingers brushing against Daniel's for the briefest second, a fleeting contact that felt strangely grounding. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a breath, the words too small for what she felt, but all she had. Daniel gave a slight nod, already stepping back, already fading into the background as if he had never intended to be noticed at all. But just before she turned to leave, he glanced down, his eyes catching on the name written in soft blue letters across the baby bottle tucked beside the formula. Noah. The world didn't stop. The store didn't quiet. But something in his gaze did. Just for a second. Then it was gone. Emily pushed through the automatic doors into the cold night air, the distant echo of early fireworks crackling faintly across the sky, her breath visible in short bursts as she held Noah closer, unaware that behind her, inside the bright artificial glow of that small store, a man who had everything money could buy stood still for the first time that night, staring at a name he couldn't quite forget. The automatic doors slid shut behind Emily Parker with a soft mechanical sigh, sealing in the warmth she could not afford and releasing her into the biting cold of a December night, where the air stung her cheeks and the distant crack of fireworks echoed like reminders that somewhere, people were celebrating beginnings while she was still trying to survive endings. She adjusted Noah against her chest, pulling the thin blanket tighter around his small body as he stirred, his tiny fingers curling instinctively into the fabric of her worn coat, trusting her in a way that made her chest ache more than the cold ever could. "It is okay," she whispered, more to herself than to him, her breath visible in faint clouds that disappeared as quickly as they formed, just like the fragile sense of relief she had felt inside the store. The parking lot stretched wide and uneven under flickering lights, her old car sitting near the far edge like it, too, had been forgotten, its faded paint and slight dent on the passenger door catching the glow of passing headlights in dull reflections. Each step toward it felt heavier than it should have, exhaustion settling into her bones as the adrenaline faded, leaving behind the familiar weight of everything she had to carry alone. She reached the car, balancing Noah carefully as she fumbled with her keys, her fingers numb, her movements slower than she wanted, until finally the door clicked open and she slid inside, closing it quickly to trap what little warmth remained. The silence inside was immediate, thick, almost comforting, broken only by Noah's soft breathing and the distant hum of traffic beyond the lot. For a moment, she did not move. She just sat there, hands resting on the steering wheel, eyes fixed on nothing, letting the reality of what had just happened settle in. A stranger had helped her. No questions. No judgment. No hidden condition. Just kindness. It felt unfamiliar. Almost unreal. Her gaze dropped to the bag on the passenger seat, the can of formula visible through the thin plastic, and her throat tightened as she reached over, touching it lightly as if confirming it was still there. "We are okay tonight," she murmured, her voice steadier now, though her eyes shimmered with unshed tears she refused to let fall. Noah shifted again, letting out a soft sound that was not quite a cry, and she leaned over, brushing her lips gently against his forehead, grounding herself in the simple truth that he was here, safe, and that was enough for now. She started the engine, the car responding with a reluctant rumble that matched her own weariness, and as the heater sputtered to life, pushing out uneven bursts of lukewarm air, she pulled out of the parking space, merging slowly onto the street where headlights streamed in both directions, people rushing toward countdowns and celebrations she could not be part of. She did not notice the black car that remained parked near the entrance, engine still running, its driver sitting quietly behind the wheel, watching as her taillights disappeared into the flow of the night. Inside that car, Daniel Carter leaned back slightly, one hand resting against his jaw, his thoughts not on the upcoming midnight gathering he was already late for, not on the messages lighting up his phone, not on the expectations waiting for him at a house filled with people who measured time in champagne glasses and resolutions. Instead, his mind returned, again and again, to a single detail that refused to fade. Noah. He had seen countless names, signed countless documents, approved deals worth more than most people would see in a lifetime, yet somehow, that one simple name, written in soft blue letters on a baby bottle, lingered with a quiet insistence he could not explain. It was not just recognition. It was something deeper. Something unfinished. His phone buzzed again, more urgent this time, but he did not reach for it immediately. Outside, another firework burst across the sky, scattering light in fleeting brilliance before dissolving into darkness, and for reasons he could not quite understand, Daniel found himself wondering not about the party he was missing, but about where that woman and her child were heading, and why, out of everything that had happened that night, helping her felt like the only moment that had actually mattered. The road stretched ahead in long, quiet lines, illuminated by streetlights that flickered past Emily Parker's windshield in steady intervals, each one briefly lighting her tired face before fading again into shadow, like moments she could not hold on to long enough to rest inside. The heater in her car struggled, pushing out uneven warmth that barely reached her fingers, but she kept both hands steady on the wheel, her focus fixed on getting home, on making it through one more night without anything falling apart. Noah stirred softly in the back seat, secured in his worn car seat, the faint rustle of his blanket and the gentle rhythm of his breathing grounding her in a way nothing else could. She glanced at him through the rearview mirror, her expression softening just a little, just enough to remind herself why she kept going even when every part of her felt like stopping. "We are almost there," she said quietly, her voice carrying a fragile promise she hoped she could keep. Outside, the city shifted as she drove farther from the bright center, the buildings growing older, the lights dimmer, the sidewalks quieter, until the sounds of celebration became distant echoes instead of something close enough to touch. By the time she turned onto her street, the air felt colder, the silence deeper, broken only by the occasional burst of fireworks somewhere far above, colors she could not see but could still imagine painting the sky. She pulled into a narrow parking space in front of a modest apartment building, its brick exterior worn by time, a single porch light flickering weakly above the entrance. Turning off the engine brought an immediate stillness, the kind that made everything feel heavier, as if without motion, the weight of reality settled more firmly in place. For a moment, she stayed there, her hands resting on the steering wheel, her eyes closing briefly as she let out a slow breath she had been holding all evening. Then she moved, unbuckling her seatbelt, reaching for Noah, lifting him carefully into her arms as he let out a soft, sleepy sound and nestled closer without waking. The cold hit her again as she stepped out, sharper this time, but she barely noticed, her focus already shifting to the familiar routine of getting inside, up the stairs, through the door that separated her small world from everything else. Inside the building, the air was stale but warmer, the faint hum of an old heater echoing through the narrow hallway, and the smell of someone else's cooking lingering faintly in the background. She climbed the stairs slowly, one careful step at a time, balancing Noah and the bag, her body moving on memory more than energy, until she reached her door at the end of the hall. The key turned with a soft click, and when she stepped inside, the space greeted her with quiet simplicity, a small living room that doubled as everything else, a worn couch, a second-hand table, a lamp casting a soft yellow glow that felt more comforting than the bright lights she had left behind. She closed the door gently behind her, shutting out the cold, the noise, the world that kept asking more from her than she had to give. Setting the bag on the table, she moved with practiced care, placing Noah in his crib, adjusting his blanket, watching for a moment as his tiny chest rose and fell in steady rhythm, a small life completely unaware of how much he had already changed hers. Only then did she allow herself to sit, her shoulders lowering as the tension eased just slightly, her eyes drifting back to the formula on the table. It was a simple thing. Ordinary. Something most people would not think twice about. But tonight, it felt like something more. A quiet reminder that even in the hardest moments, someone had chosen to help without asking for anything in return. She reached out, her fingers brushing against the cool surface of the can, and for the first time in a long while, the thought crossed her mind that maybe, just maybe, the world had not completely forgotten her. Miles away, in a house filled with light and voices and the soft clink of glasses, Daniel Carter stood near a floor-to-ceiling window, the city spread out beneath him in a sea of glowing lines and distant movement, yet none of it held his attention. Around him, people laughed, conversations overlapped, the countdown to midnight approaching with a kind of excitement he could not quite feel, but he remained still, his gaze fixed not on the skyline, but on the reflection staring back at him in the glass. In his hand, a folder rested loosely, opened moments before, its contents familiar yet suddenly different, a document he had seen before, reviewed before, signed without hesitation before. Until tonight. His eyes moved again to a single line, a single name printed clearly in black ink. Noah Carter. The room behind him blurred into background noise as something quiet but undeniable settled into place inside his thoughts, connecting a moment in a grocery store to a detail he could no longer ignore. He did not know how. He did not know why. But for the first time in a long time, certainty was replaced by something else entirely. And it refused to let go. The room behind Daniel Carter continued to pulse with quiet celebration, the low hum of voices blending with the soft clinking of glasses and distant laughter, yet it all felt strangely distant, like a scene he was observing rather than living, his attention anchored to the document in his hand and the single name that refused to settle into something ordinary. He had seen it before, many times, in meetings, in briefings, in conversations that carried the weight of legacy and expectation, but tonight it felt different, as if the ink itself had shifted meaning. Noah Carter. His thumb brushed lightly over the edge of the paper, not touching the name directly, but close enough to feel its presence, his mind replaying the moment from earlier with unsettling clarity, the soft blue letters on a baby bottle, the quiet way the woman had held her child, the absence of anything performative in her struggle. It had not been a staged moment. It had not been designed to impress. It had simply been real. And that was what made it harder to dismiss. Daniel, a voice called from behind him, pulling gently at his attention, but not enough to break it. He turned slightly, just enough to acknowledge the speaker without fully stepping away from his thoughts. It was his family's attorney, standing with a composed expression, a glass of water in hand, as if even in a room full of celebration, his role remained anchored in practicality. "We are about to finalize the review. Are you ready?" Daniel hesitated, not outwardly, not in a way anyone else would notice, but internally, there was a pause, a shift, something recalibrating. Ready had always been a simple answer before. Now it felt incomplete. "Give me a minute," he said quietly, his voice even, controlled, but carrying a subtle weight that had not been there earlier in the evening. The attorney nodded, accustomed to patience, and stepped back without question. Alone again at the window, Daniel exhaled slowly, his gaze drifting beyond the glass to the city below, where distant bursts of light painted brief colors across the sky, each one fading almost as quickly as it appeared. Moments. Fleeting. Unpredictable. He closed the folder gently, not with finality, but with intention, as if he needed space to think without the words in front of him guiding his conclusions. Turning away from the window, he moved through the room with quiet purpose, weaving past conversations and polite smiles, none of which he fully registered, until he reached a quieter corner where his assistant stood reviewing something on a tablet. "I need information," Daniel said, his tone calm but precise, the kind that did not invite delay. She looked up immediately, attentive. "Of course. What are we looking for?" For a brief moment, he considered how to phrase it, how to reduce something that felt significant into something actionable, but the simplicity of the truth cut through that hesitation. "A woman," he said, then added, "and her child. I saw them tonight. Grocery store on 8th and Lincoln. She paid. In coins. The baby's name is Noah." His assistant blinked, not confused, but surprised by the specificity, by the departure from the usual requests that filled his schedule. "Do you have a last name?" she asked carefully. Daniel's jaw tightened slightly, not in frustration, but in recognition of the gap. "No," he admitted, the word unfamiliar in his vocabulary, where details were usually complete, controlled, documented. "But I need you to find them." There was no urgency in his volume, no raised voice, but the intent beneath the words was unmistakable, steady and unwavering. His assistant nodded once, already shifting into action. "I will start immediately." As she moved away, Daniel remained still for a moment, his gaze unfocused, his thoughts aligning into something clearer, something he could not ignore any longer. Across the city, in a small apartment filled with quiet and the soft hum of an aging heater, Emily Parker sat at her kitchen table, a single lamp casting warm light across the surface as she carefully prepared a bottle, measuring, pouring, checking the temperature with practiced care, her movements slow but deliberate, each step grounded in routine that gave her a sense of control in a life that often felt uncertain. Noah stirred softly in his crib, sensing the change, and when she lifted him into her arms again, his small body relaxed against her as if nothing in the world could go wrong as long as she was there. She sat back down, cradling him gently, feeding him with quiet focus, her eyes soft, her expression calmer than it had been hours before. Outside, another firework lit the sky, unseen from her window but felt in the faint vibration that followed, a reminder that somewhere, something new was beginning. She did not know that in another part of the same city, someone had just made a decision that would soon bring their worlds back together. And this time, it would not be by chance. Morning arrived quietly, without celebration, without countdowns, just a pale gray light slipping through the thin curtains of Emily Parker's apartment as the city outside slowly shook off the remains of the night before, and for a brief moment, everything felt still, as if the world had paused long enough to breathe. Emily was already awake, sitting at the small kitchen table with a cup of coffee she had reheated twice, its warmth fading faster than she could drink it, her eyes heavy but alert, trained by necessity rather than rest. Across the room, Noah slept peacefully in his crib, one small hand curled near his face, his breathing soft and even, completely unaware of the quiet calculations his mother made every single morning before the day even began. She glanced toward him, her expression softening in that instinctive way that no exhaustion could erase, then back down to the folded bills in front of her, rent, utilities, groceries, each one a reminder that survival was not a single moment, but a constant negotiation. The can of formula sat nearby, unopened, almost symbolic now, not just for what it was, but for what it represented, a small interruption in a pattern that rarely offered relief. She reached for it, turning it slightly, her fingers tracing the label absent-mindedly, her thoughts drifting back to the man from the night before, the way he had spoken, not with pity, not with impatience, just quiet certainty, as if helping had not been a decision, but a natural response. It unsettled her in a way she could not quite explain, not because it was wrong, but because it was rare. On the other side of the city, Daniel Carter stood in his office, the early sunlight stretching across polished floors and glass walls, everything precise, organized, exactly as it should be, yet his attention was not on the reports laid out before him or the messages waiting to be answered. Instead, he stood near his desk, jacket untouched, tie loosened slightly, a sign of distraction so subtle most would miss it, but not to someone who knew him well. His assistant entered quietly, carrying a tablet, her movements efficient, composed, but there was a shift in her expression, a signal that what she had found mattered. "I have something," she said, stepping closer, holding out the screen. Daniel took it without hesitation, his eyes scanning quickly, absorbing details with practiced speed, but this time, the information did not settle into neat categories. It lingered. Emily Parker. Age 27. Part-time employment. No listed partner. 1 child. Noah Parker. Address confirmed. His grip on the tablet tightened just slightly, not enough to draw attention, but enough for him to feel the shift internally, the connection forming between what he had seen and what he now knew. Parker. Not Carter. And yet, the name still echoed in his mind, refusing to align with coincidence. "There is more," his assistant added, her tone careful, respectful of the weight she sensed beneath the surface. The hospital record attached to the trust document references a child born under a private arrangement. The timeline, she paused briefly, allowing the implication to form on its own, matches. Daniel looked up slowly, his expression unchanged to anyone else, but something in his eyes had sharpened, focused, as if a blurred image had suddenly come into clarity. He handed the tablet back without comment, stepping away from the desk, his mind moving faster now, connecting details, questioning assumptions he had never needed to question before. Across town, Emily lifted Noah gently from his crib as he began to stir, his soft sounds filling the quiet apartment, and as she held him close, adjusting the blanket around his small body, she pressed her cheek lightly against his head, grounding herself in the only certainty she trusted. "We are going to be okay," she whispered, the words carrying both hope and determination, a promise she repeated not because it was guaranteed, but because she refused to let it be anything else. Back in the office, Daniel reached for his keys, the motion decisive, his earlier hesitation gone, replaced by something steadier, something intentional. "Cancel my morning meetings," he said, his voice calm, leaving no room for negotiation. His assistant nodded immediately, already adjusting her schedule. "Where will you be?" she asked, not out of curiosity, but necessity. Daniel paused for just a fraction of a second, then answered with quiet certainty. "I am going to meet them." And for the first time since the night before, the direction of everything ahead felt clear. The engine started with a smooth, controlled hum, the kind that did not struggle, did not hesitate, responding instantly as Daniel Carter pulled away from the curb, leaving behind a world where everything had always been predictable, every outcome calculated, every decision backed by certainty, and stepped into something far less defined. The streets were quieter now, the remnants of celebration scattered in subtle ways, a stray decoration caught on a lamppost, empty sidewalks where crowds had stood hours before, the city returning to its routine as if nothing significant had happened, as if lives had not quietly shifted direction overnight. Daniel drove. Without music, without distraction, his focus not on the traffic or the route, but on the address his assistant had provided, each turn bringing him closer to something he could not yet fully explain, only feel. He had built his life on facts, on verified information, on things that could be proven, but this was different. This began with a feeling, a moment that should have been insignificant, yet refused to be dismissed. Across town, Emily Parker moved through her small apartment with practiced rhythm, balancing Noah on her hip as she gathered what little she needed for the day, a worn bag, a folded blanket, a bottle prepared carefully, each motion efficient, each decision shaped by necessity. She checked the time on the clock above the stove, calculating silently, the bus schedule, the hours she could work, the minutes she could afford to lose if anything went wrong. There was no margin for error, not in her world. She slipped on her coat, adjusting Noah's hat gently over his small head, making sure it covered his ears, her touch instinctive, protective, then paused briefly as she reached for the door, her hand resting on the handle a second longer than needed. Something felt different, not in a way she could name, just a faint shift, like the quiet before something changed. She shook it off, stepping out into the hallway, locking the door behind her with a soft click that echoed slightly in the narrow space. Outside, the air was sharp again, colder than it had been the night before, biting at her cheeks as she adjusted her grip on Noah and started down the sidewalk, her pace steady, her eyes forward. She did not notice the black car that turned slowly onto her street, its movement controlled, deliberate, blending into the quiet rhythm of the neighborhood. Daniel slowed as he approached the building, his gaze scanning briefly, taking in details he was not used to noticing, the worn brick, the uneven steps, the flickering porch light that had not been fixed, small things that spoke of a different kind of life, one where maintenance was not immediate, where time and resources were stretched thin. He parked a short distance away, not directly in front, not wanting to draw attention, though attention was something he rarely avoided. This time, it felt different. He stepped out, the cold air sharp, but grounding, his breath visible for a brief moment before fading, much like the certainty he had left behind earlier that morning. As he approached the building, his steps slowed slightly, not from hesitation, but from awareness, a recognition that whatever came next could not be approached the way he handled business, with control and expectation. This was not a negotiation. This was something else entirely. At the same moment, Emily stepped out onto the sidewalk, adjusting the strap of her bag, her attention focused on the path ahead, until she looked up and saw him. The distance between them was not far, just a few yards, but it felt like something larger, something measured not in space, but in the weight of everything that had led to that exact moment. Daniel stopped. Not abruptly, not dramatically, just enough to acknowledge the reality in front of him. Emily did the same, her expression shifting from routine focus to quiet recognition, her eyes narrowing slightly as she tried to place where she had seen him before, then widening just enough as the memory aligned. The grocery store. The voice. The moment. Neither of them spoke immediately. The world did not stop, cars still passed at the end of the street, a distant door closed somewhere nearby, life continued as it always did, but between them, something had already changed. Daniel inclined his head slightly, a gesture of acknowledgement, simple, respectful. "Good morning," he said, his voice calm, steady, carrying none of the urgency that had brought him there, only intention. Emily adjusted Noah gently in her arms, her grip tightening just a little, protective without thinking. "Morning," she replied, her tone cautious but not closed, her eyes searching his face for something she could trust, or something she should be wary of. Daniel's gaze dropped briefly to the child, to Noah, then returned to her, the connection in his mind no longer abstract, no longer distant. It was here. Real. And it was no longer something he could walk away from. The air between them held a quiet tension, not sharp or hostile, but unfamiliar, like two different worlds pausing long enough to recognize each other without fully understanding what that meant yet, and for a brief moment, neither Daniel Carter nor Emily Parker moved forward, both instinctively measuring the situation in their own way. Emily shifted Noah slightly in her arms, a subtle motion, protective, grounding, her eyes steady on Daniel's face, searching not just for recognition, but for intention, because kindness from a stranger was one thing, but a stranger showing up the next morning was something else entirely. "You found me," she said finally, her voice calm but edged with quiet caution, not an accusation, not yet, but not blind trust either. Daniel did not look surprised by her directness, in fact, something in his expression suggested he respected it, as if honesty, even guarded honesty, was something he valued more than polite distance. "Yes," he answered simply, no attempt to soften it, no unnecessary explanation layered on top, just the truth, delivered in the same measured tone he had used the night before. Emily's grip on Noah tightened just slightly, her instincts alert now, her mind moving quickly through possibilities, reasons, outcomes, none of them clear. "Why?" she asked, the single word carrying more weight than its size suggested. Daniel exhaled slowly, not out of frustration, but to steady his thoughts, because for the first time in a long time, the answer was not something he could deliver in numbers or contracts or facts alone. His gaze dropped briefly to Noah, taking in the small details again, the way the baby rested comfortably, unaware of the shift happening around him, then returned to Emily. "Because I saw something last night," he said, his voice quieter now, more deliberate, as if each word mattered. "And I could not ignore it." Emily's brow furrowed slightly, confusion mixing with suspicion, her mind trying to connect his words to something concrete, something she could understand. "You saw me struggling to pay," she said, her tone flattening just a little, protective walls rising, "that does not usually bring people back the next day." Daniel shook his head once, not dismissing her interpretation, but clarifying it. "That is not what I meant," he replied, and there was a shift in his voice now, something more personal, less distant. "I saw your son's name." The words landed differently, not loud, not dramatic, but enough to change the air between them. Emily's expression stilled, her eyes narrowing slightly, not in anger, but in confusion that bordered on concern. "His name?" she repeated, the question soft but guarded, as if she was not sure where this was going, or if she wanted to. Daniel nodded, his gaze steady, unwavering now that he had crossed the line from observation into explanation. "Noah," he said, the name spoken with a quiet certainty that made it feel heavier than before. Emily adjusted Noah instinctively, her hand moving gently over his back, a reflex that grounded her even as her thoughts began to shift, her attention sharpening. "It is a common name," she said, though her voice lacked the firmness it had a moment ago, uncertainty threading through it despite her attempt to remain composed. Daniel did not argue with that. "It is," he agreed, and for a second, it seemed like the conversation might dissolve into something simple, something dismissible. But it did not. "But not in the context I saw it," he continued, his tone steady, controlled, yet carrying an undercurrent that was impossible to ignore. Emily held his gaze now, fully attentive, the cautious distance still there, but something else beginning to form beneath it, something closer to unease, not because of him, but because of what he was implying without fully saying it yet. The street around them remained quiet, the ordinary world continuing without interruption, but in that moment, everything felt slightly off balance, as if the ground beneath a simple morning had shifted just enough to matter. "What context?" she asked finally, her voice lower now, more careful, as if she was stepping into something she could not yet see clearly. Daniel did not answer immediately. Not because he did not have the words, but because he understood, even now, that once he said them, nothing would remain as simple as it had been just minutes before. He looked at Noah once more, then back at Emily, his expression calm, but resolute. "In a document that should not exist," he said quietly, "unless there is something neither of us knows yet." And in that moment, the space between them was no longer just distance. It was a question. Emily Parker did not move, but something inside her did, a subtle shift from cautious curiosity to something more alert, more guarded, as if an invisible line had just been crossed and she was not sure yet whether to step forward or pull back. Her eyes stayed on Daniel Carter, searching his face for any sign that this was a misunderstanding she could easily dismiss, something simple, something harmless, but what she found instead was steadiness. Not forceful, not invasive, just present in a way that made it harder to ignore. "That does not make sense," she said slowly, her voice measured, each word placed carefully as if testing the ground beneath her. "My son is my responsibility. There is no document like that." Daniel did not interrupt, did not challenge her statement directly, because he understood that from her perspective, it should not exist. "I agree," he said, his tone calm, almost reassuring, but not dismissive. "It should not." The agreement hung between them, not resolving anything, only deepening the question. Emily adjusted Noah again, her hand resting lightly against his back, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breathing, anchoring herself in something real, something she knew without question. "Then why are you here?" she asked, her gaze unwavering now, the uncertainty still there, but steadied by the need to protect what was hers. Daniel hesitated for just a fraction of a second, not because he lacked an answer, but because he was choosing how much of it to give. "Because the timeline matches," he said finally, the words quiet but precise, each one carrying weight without needing emphasis. Emily's expression shifted again, confusion tightening into something sharper, her mind moving quickly, trying to follow a path she had not expected to be on this morning. "What timeline?" she pressed, her voice firmer now, no longer tentative, because whatever this was, it was no longer abstract. Daniel took a step closer, not invading her space, but reducing the distance enough to make the conversation feel more grounded, more direct. "A private record," he explained, his voice steady, controlled, "a child listed under a trust agreement. The date of birth, the medical details, they align with your son." The words did not land softly. They did not explode either. They settled, heavy, undeniable in their implication, leaving no immediate place for them to go. Emily's grip on Noah tightened instinctively, her body responding before her thoughts could fully catch up, her protective instinct rising in quiet but unmistakable force. "No," she said, not loudly, not emotionally, but firmly, the kind of refusal that came from certainty, not denial. "That is not possible." Daniel did not argue with her, did not push against the word, because he could see that her certainty came from truth, her truth, not from ignorance. "I am not saying it is," he replied, his tone even, careful not to escalate what was already fragile. "I am saying something does not add up." Emily's eyes searched his again, this time not just for intention, but for credibility, for any sign that he was mistaken, or worse, that he was creating something that would disrupt her life in ways she could not control. "You expect me to believe that my son's name is in some kind of legal document tied to you?" she asked, the question sharper now, edged with disbelief that felt justified. Daniel held her gaze, not defensive, not offended, just steady. "I do not expect you to believe anything yet," he said. "I only expect you to hear me." The simplicity of that statement paused something in her, not trust, not acceptance, but resistance, just enough to allow the conversation to continue. A car passed at the end of the street, its tires rolling over damp pavement, the sound grounding the moment in something ordinary, even as everything between them felt anything but. Emily looked down briefly at Noah, at the small, peaceful face that had never known anything beyond her care, her decisions, her life, then back at Daniel, her expression no longer just cautious, but searching, as if she was standing at the edge of something she could not yet see clearly, but could not ignore either. "What are you not telling me?" she asked quietly, the question no longer defensive, but direct, because whatever this was, it was not just about a name anymore. Daniel did not look away. "That I do not think this is a coincidence," he answered, his voice calm, but carrying a certainty that made the air between them feel heavier, as if the truth, whatever it was, had already begun to surface, whether they were ready for it or not. The words lingered in the air long after Daniel Carter had spoken them, not loud, not forceful, but heavy in a way that made silence feel louder than any response Emily Parker could immediately give, and for a moment, she simply stood there, her mind moving quickly through possibilities that did not align, explanations that did not fit, her grip on Noah steady but firm, as if grounding herself in something real while everything else began to feel uncertain. "Not a coincidence," she repeated quietly, the phrase sounding different when it came from her, less certain, more like a question she was not ready to ask out loud. Her eyes searched his again, looking for something she could hold on to, a flaw in his reasoning, a mistake in his assumption, but what she found instead was consistency, the kind that did not come from impulse, but from careful thought. "You are talking about my son like he is part of something I have never even heard of," she said, her voice still controlled, but carrying an edge now, not anger, but protectiveness sharpened by confusion. Daniel did not react defensively, did not step back from her words, because he understood that this was not about him, not really. "I am talking about a connection that should not exist," he replied, his tone steady, choosing each word with care, but appears to, whether we understand it or not. Emily shook her head slightly, not dismissing him entirely, but resisting the implication, her instincts pushing back against anything that suggested her life had been influenced by something outside her knowledge. "I did not sign anything," she said, more firmly now, her voice carrying the weight of certainty built from lived experience. "No contracts, no agreements, nothing like what you are describing." Daniel listened without interruption, his focus not on countering her, but on understanding the boundaries of what she knew. "Then someone else did," he said quietly, not as a contradiction, but as a continuation of the logic that had brought him here. The possibility settled differently, not as rejection, but as something else entirely, something that opened a door Emily had not considered, and for a brief second, her expression shifted, not to acceptance, but to hesitation, the kind that comes when a thought begins to form that you do not yet want to follow. "That does not make sense," she said again, though this time, the words lacked the same firmness as before, uncertainty threading through them in a way she could not fully hide. Daniel nodded slightly, acknowledging that reaction without challenging it. "It does not," he agreed, his voice calm, almost reassuring, "but the details are too specific to ignore." The street remained quiet around them, the ordinary world continuing as if nothing unusual was happening, yet between them, the conversation had shifted into something deeper, something that no longer fit within simple explanations. Emily looked down at Noah. Her gaze softening for just a moment, her hand adjusting his blanket instinctively, as if the act itself could shield him from whatever this was becoming. "Even if what you are saying is true," she said slowly, lifting her eyes back to Daniel, "what does that have to do with me now?" It was not denial anymore. It was a question. And that changed everything. Daniel took a small breath, not out of uncertainty, but to steady the weight of what he was about to say, because this was no longer about observation or theory. This was about consequence. "If there is a legal document tied to your son," he said, his voice measured, "then there are decisions already made that affect him, whether you were part of them or not." Emily's expression tightened, not in fear, but in resolve, the kind that forms when something threatens the one thing you cannot compromise on. "No one makes decisions for my child except me," she said, her voice quiet, but firm enough to leave no doubt about where she stood. Daniel held her gaze, not challenging that statement, but recognizing it, respecting it in a way that was clear without needing to be stated. "Then we need to find out exactly what this is," he replied, his tone steady, not commanding, not forceful, but aligned with hers in a way that shifted the dynamic between them, no longer opposing sides, but something closer to parallel paths. Emily did not answer immediately, her eyes still on his, measuring, weighing, deciding, and in that moment, the uncertainty did not disappear, but it changed shape, becoming something else entirely. Not fear. Not trust. But the beginning of a choice. Emily Parker felt the weight of that choice settle into her chest, not sudden, not overwhelming, but steady, like something that had been approaching quietly and had finally arrived, and for a moment, she looked away from Daniel Carter, her gaze drifting down to Noah as if the answer might be written somewhere in the calm rise and fall of his breathing. The world around them remained unchanged, a neighbor's door closing down the street, the distant hum of a passing car, ordinary sounds continuing without pause, yet inside that moment, everything had shifted into something that demanded attention. "If we do this," she said slowly, her voice thoughtful now rather than defensive, "I need to know exactly what it involves." Her eyes lifted back to Daniel, steady again, not uncertain, but careful, the kind of clarity that came from knowing what she could and could not risk. Daniel nodded once, acknowledging not just her words, but the boundary they represented. "It involves clarity," he said, his tone calm, measured, and transparency. "We review the document together, verify the details, and understand how your son's name is connected to something it should not be." Emily watched him closely, measuring the simplicity of his explanation against the complexity she felt building beneath it. "And if it is connected?" she asked, the question direct, no longer avoiding the possibility, even if she did not accept it yet. Daniel did not hesitate this time. "Then we decide what to do with that information," he answered, his voice steady, not offering solutions before understanding, not assuming control where it was not his to take. That mattered. More than she expected. Emily adjusted Noah gently, her hand resting against his back as she considered the path in front of her, not the easiest one, not the most comfortable, but the one that would give her answers instead of questions. "I am not signing anything," she said, her tone firm, establishing her position clearly, "and I am not agreeing to anything beyond understanding what this is." Daniel's expression did not change, but something in his posture reflected agreement without resistance. "That is all I am asking," he replied, his voice even, aligned with her terms without hesitation. The balance between them shifted again, not fully equal, not yet, but closer than before, built not on trust, but on mutual intention. Emily glanced briefly down the street, as if checking the time without looking at a clock, the rhythm of her day still present, still waiting, responsibilities that did not pause just because something unexpected had appeared. "I have work," she said, her voice practical now, grounding the moment in reality, "and I cannot afford to miss it." Daniel nodded, already adjusting to that constraint, already understanding that whatever this was, it had to fit within her world, not the other way around. "Then we work around that," he said, his tone straightforward, solution-oriented but not imposing. "There is a law office a few blocks from here. We can meet there after your shift. I will have the document ready." Emily considered that, not immediately agreeing, but not rejecting it either, her mind mapping the logistics, the time, the risk, and the necessity. "And this stays between us," she added, her eyes returning to his, sharp now, protective in a way that made her stance unmistakable. "No surprises. No people showing up without warning." Daniel met her gaze without hesitation. "Agreed," he said simply, no conditions attached, no attempt to negotiate that boundary. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke, the decision settling into place not with certainty, but with acceptance, the kind that comes when there is no better alternative than to move forward. Emily adjusted the strap of her bag, shifting Noah slightly as she prepared to continue her day, her movements returning to the rhythm she knew, even if her thoughts remained somewhere else entirely. 6 o'clock, she said, her voice steady, marking the time not just as a plan, but as a commitment to face whatever was waiting on the other side of it. Daniel inclined his head once in acknowledgement. 6 o'clock, he repeated, his tone calm, but carrying a quiet finality. Emily turned then, not abruptly, not avoiding him, but moving forward because she had to, because her life did not stop, not for questions, not for possibilities, not even for something that could change everything. She walked down the sidewalk, her pace steady, her focus returning outward, yet something within her remained shifted, aware, waiting. Daniel stayed where he was for a moment longer, watching as the distance between them grew again, not as it had before, defined by separation, but now by something else entirely. A point of return. And for the first time, that was enough. The rest of the day did not slow down for Emily Parker, it never did, and by the time the afternoon light began to fade into the muted gray of early evening, her energy had been stretched thin across hours that demanded more than she had to give, yet she kept moving, because stopping was not an option she allowed herself. The small diner where she worked carried its usual rhythm, the steady clatter of plates, the low murmur of conversations, the scent of coffee that lingered in the air, all of it familiar, all of it predictable, and in that predictability, she found just enough stability to keep her thoughts from drifting too far into what was waiting at 6 o'clock. She moved between tables with quiet efficiency, balancing trays, refilling cups, offering polite smiles that came from habit rather than ease, her mind focused on the immediate tasks in front of her, yet beneath that surface, something remained unsettled, a quiet awareness that this was not just another day ending like all the others. During a brief pause, she stepped into the back room, checking her phone for the time, the numbers confirming what she already felt, the moment was getting closer. For a second, she allowed herself to think about it directly, about the document, about the name, about the possibility that something beyond her control had already touched her life without her knowing, and her chest tightened slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of uncertainty that came with it. "Emily," a voice called from the front, pulling her back, grounding her in what she understood, what she could manage. "Coming," she replied quickly, slipping the phone back into her pocket, returning to the floor without hesitation, because until 6 o'clock arrived, this was still her reality. Across the city, Daniel Carter sat in a quiet office, the space prepared with intention rather than display, the table cleared except for a single folder placed precisely in the center, its presence understated, yet significant. He had reviewed the contents more than once, not because he doubted what was there, but because he wanted to be certain of how he would present it, not as a conclusion, not as a claim, but as information that needed to be understood carefully, respectfully. His assistant stood near the doorway, confirming final details, her tone professional, efficient, but her eyes occasionally shifting toward him, aware that this meeting was different from the others that filled his schedule. "Everything is ready," she said, holding a tablet at her side. Daniel nodded once, his attention still on the folder, his thoughts steady, but not rigid, open in a way that required patience rather than control. "Good," he replied, his voice calm, though quieter than usual, as if he was already preparing for the conversation ahead. As the clock moved closer to the appointed time, the city outside transitioned again, headlights beginning to appear in steady lines, the hum of evening traffic building, people returning home, continuing routines that felt unchanged, yet for both of them, this day had already shifted into something else entirely. When Emily finally stepped out of the diner, the air had cooled again, the sky dimming into that soft, in-between light where the day had not fully ended, but night was already approaching. She adjusted her coat, pulling it closer around her, her step slower now, not from exhaustion alone, but from the awareness of where she was going, each step bringing her closer to something she could not yet define. She reached the building Daniel had mentioned, pausing just outside for a brief moment, her hand resting against the door handle, her breath steadying as she grounded herself in the only thing that mattered, the need to understand, to protect, to remain in control of her own choices. Then she stepped inside. Upstairs, Daniel stood as the door opened, his posture straight, his expression composed, but not distant, not closed, simply ready. When Emily entered the room, the space between them felt different from the morning, not unfamiliar, but no longer accidental. It was intentional now. She took a few steps forward, her gaze briefly shifting to the folder on the table before returning to him, her expression steady, prepared. "I am here," she said, her voice calm, not hesitant, not uncertain, but grounded in the decision she had already made. Daniel inclined his head slightly, acknowledging not just her presence, but the significance of her choice. "Thank you for coming," he replied quietly, then gestured toward the table. "Let us find out the truth." And for the first time since this began, the question between them was no longer waiting in the distance. It was right in front of them. Emily Parker did not sit immediately, her eyes fixed on the folder at the center of the table as if it carried more than paper, more than ink, as if it held a version of her life she had never agreed to, and for a moment, she simply stood there, steady, composed, but fully aware that once she moved forward, there would be no returning to not knowing. Daniel Carter did not rush her, did not gesture again, did not speak, understanding that this moment belonged to her, that whatever was inside that folder affected her world in ways it never had for him. Slowly, Emily stepped closer, her movements controlled, deliberate, and took the chair across from him, her posture straight, her hands resting lightly on the edge of the table, not touching the folder yet, not ready to claim it as something real. "Open it," she said quietly, her voice calm, but carrying a firmness that made it clear she would not hesitate once the truth was in front of her. Daniel nodded once, reaching forward and opening the folder with careful precision, turning it so that it faced her, not him, an intentional choice that shifted the control of the moment to where it belonged. The pages inside were clean, structured, filled with language that was formal, exact, the kind that left little room for interpretation, yet as Emily's eyes moved across the first lines, the meaning did not settle immediately, her mind taking a moment to catch up with what she was seeing. Then it did. Her breath paused, not dramatically, not visibly to anyone else, but enough that she felt it, a subtle interruption in the rhythm of her body as the words aligned into something undeniable. Noah Carter, she read silently, the name appearing clearly, unmistakably, followed by details that mirrored what she knew to be true, date of birth, hospital location, medical reference numbers, all precise, all accurate, all impossible. Her fingers tightened slightly against the edge of the table, not reaching for the paper, not yet, as if touching it would confirm something she was not ready to accept. "This is not right," she said, her voice steady, but lower now, the certainty she had held earlier shifting into something more complex, not disbelief, but confrontation with something she could not explain away. Daniel watched her carefully, not interrupting, not guiding her reaction, allowing her to process in her own way, because this was not his truth to impose, it was hers to recognize. "Look at the signature page," he said gently after a moment, not directing, but suggesting, his tone measured, respectful of the pace she needed. Emily hesitated for just a second, then turned the page, her movement slower now, more deliberate, as if each action carried weight beyond itself. Her eyes moved down the document, scanning, searching, until they stopped. Her expression changed, not sharply, not dramatically, but enough that it was unmistakable, something within her shifting as recognition surfaced, unexpected, unwelcome, but undeniable. "I know this name," she said quietly, her voice no longer guarded, but distant, as if pulled slightly away from the room and into a memory she had not visited in a long time. Daniel remained still, his focus entirely on her now, the document no longer the center, but her reaction to it. "Who?" he asked, his tone calm, not pressing, but open. Emily's eyes remained on the page, her thoughts aligning slowly, piecing together fragments she had not considered connected before. "The clinic," she said, her voice steady but softer now, "the one I went to before Noah was born. They said it was routine, just paperwork, standard procedure." She lifted her gaze slightly, not fully meeting his yet, but no longer looking at the document either. "I did not read everything," she admitted, the words simple, but carrying a weight of realization that settled heavily in the space between them. Daniel's expression did not change, but something in his eyes sharpened, not with judgment, but with clarity, the missing piece beginning to take shape. "Then someone used that," he said quietly, not as an accusation, but as a conclusion drawn carefully, logically. Emily finally looked up at him, her eyes steady now, but different from before, no longer just cautious, no longer just protective, but aware in a way she had not been earlier that day. "Without telling me what it really was," she said, her voice firm again, but this time grounded in understanding rather than assumption. The room felt quieter now, not because the world outside had changed, but because the truth had moved from possibility into something real, something that could no longer be ignored. Emily looked back at the document, then at Daniel, her expression composed, but resolute. "So now we know," she said, not as a question, but as a statement, one that carried both clarity and consequence. And in that moment, the unknown had taken shape, and it was no longer just a mystery. It was something they would have to face. Emily Parker closed the folder slowly, not with hesitation, but with intention, as if sealing something that could no longer be undone, her fingers resting lightly on the cover for a moment before she pulled her hand back, grounding herself in the quiet reality of the room instead of the weight of what she had just learned. Across from her, Daniel Carter remained still, watching not the document now, but her, understanding that whatever came next would not be written in legal language or defined by contracts, but by the choices she made from this point forward. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke, the silence no longer uncertain, but full, carrying the clarity they had uncovered and the consequences that followed. Emily exhaled slowly, her gaze steady as she looked up at him, no longer searching, no longer questioning the existence of what was in front of her, but measuring what it meant. "They used my situation," she said, her voice calm, not shaken, but firm in a way that reflected something deeper than emotion, something rooted in understanding. "They knew I would not question it." Daniel nodded slightly, not offering sympathy, not minimizing what she had said, simply acknowledging it as truth. "And they counted on you never finding out," he added quietly, his tone steady, not dramatic, but grounded in the same clarity. Emily leaned back slightly in her chair, her posture composed, her thoughts no longer scattered, but aligned, moving forward instead of circling what had already been revealed. "But I did," she said, and there was something in her voice now, something resolute, something that had not been there before, not because she had changed, but because she had seen something she could not ignore. Daniel held her gaze, recognizing that shift immediately, not as resistance, but as strength. Yes, he replied simply. You did. The words settled between them, not as reassurance, but as acknowledgement of a turning point neither of them could reverse. Emily glanced briefly at the folder again, then back at him, her expression calm, but decisive. What happens next is not up to them, she said, her tone clear, leaving no room for ambiguity. It is up to me. Daniel did not respond immediately, not because he disagreed, but because he understood that what she had just said defined everything that would follow, not just for her, but for him as well. Then I will support whatever you decide, he said after a moment, his voice steady, not imposing, not directing, simply offering something that aligned with her control rather than challenged it. Emily studied him for a second longer, not with suspicion, but with consideration, as if weighing not just his words, but his consistency, the way he had approached everything since the moment they met. You are already involved, she said quietly. Not as a challenge, but as recognition. This affects you too. Daniel inclined his head slightly, accepting that without resistance. It does, he admitted, his tone unchanged, but not more than it affects you. That mattered. More than anything else he could have said. Emily nodded once, a small, controlled motion that reflected acceptance, not of the situation itself, but of the path forward. She stood then, gathering her things with quiet efficiency, her movement steady, her focus clear in a way it had not been when she first walked into the room. When she reached the door, she paused briefly, her hand resting against it as she looked back at Daniel, not uncertain, not hesitant, but aware of the moment for what it was. I am not asking for help, she said, her voice calm, but firm, but I am not refusing it either. Daniel met her gaze, understanding the balance in those words, the independence they carried alongside the openness they allowed. Understood, he replied simply. Emily gave a slight nod, then opened the door and stepped out into the evening air, the coolness grounding, the world outside unchanged, yet everything within her shifted into something stronger, something clearer. As she walked away, her pace steady, her shoulders set with quiet determination, she did not look back, not because she was closing a chapter, but because she was stepping into one she would define on her own terms. Inside the room, Daniel remained where he was, the folder still on the table, the city lights beginning to glow beyond the window, and for the first time, the weight he carried was not something he had built, but something he had chosen to face. Because sometimes, the most powerful decisions are not the ones written in documents, but the ones made in moments no one else sees, when everything changes, not because it has to, but because it should.